we, the world, are going after every fossil fuel we can find. Tar sands, tar shale, Arctic drilling, deep ocean drilling, mountaintop removal. But we can't do that without guaranteeing that we push the climate system in a direction into a place where we will be handing to our children a climate system that's practically out of their control. Because if we even wait 10 years to begin to reduce emissions, then you would have, in order to restore energy balance by the end of the century, you'd have to reduce emissions 15% a year. That's just not plausible.
Geoengineering, also known as climate intervention, is being debated by the UK government on the 23rd of June 2025. This is a response to a petition signed by around 160,000 people calling for a ban on geoengineering in the UK. I've been conducting interviews on this topic for the last 15 years. In that time, the climate science data has gotten worse and worse. Successive governments around the world have failed to properly regulate in order to phase out carbon emissions from the fossil fuel industry and land use sectors that make up the main bulk of pollution. The outcomes we face are regarded by many scientists as existential around the world, and the question of geoengineering as a response polarizes climate scientists, experts, and many others involved in this space. This sequence of edits taken from my interviews between 2012 and 2025 features many leading scientists and commentators on both sides of the argument. The main focus of this video is a type of geoengineering called solar radiation modification, or SRM. Within this, there are different proposals. One mentioned here is stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, and marine cloud brightening, or MCB. These techniques aim to reduce the amount of the sun's energy that reaches the Earth's surface, thereby helping to cool the planet, while efforts continue to reduce carbon emissions worldwide. Please watch and post your own thoughts and comments below. Please know that I have included the years in which these interviews were recorded in each segment, although they're not presented in chronological sequence. What this shows is the huge inertia in this topic, while the background noise of catastrophic impacts has been moving into the foreground.
The way I like to look at a lot of these so-called geoengineering schemes is from the standpoint that as climate scientists, we're sort of planetary doctors. We're trying to diagnose the health of the planet as we continue to change our environment. And one of the principles of, in medicine, and it's an oath that all doctors take, is to first do no harm. First, above all else, do no harm. And I think that geoengineering potentially violates the sort of planetary Hippocratic oath of climate science.
I have all kinds of reservations about the notion of engineering climate. As with engineering and the other bits of the environment, we don't know the long-term results. We don't know the forms of governance that would make it work effectively. And there are risks there as well. But it does seem to me that if it looks as if our only realistic option of minimizing damage to vulnerable people is exploring some forms of engineering response, we need to know at least what they are. I'm not an enthusiast or an advocate. I'd like to know more though. And I'd like to know more partly because I'd like research of that kind to focus for people just how serious this question is if it looks as if our only option is some sort of radical interference with where we are.
Unfortunately, the reductions haven't happened enough. Removals are not scaling as quickly as they need to be to meet the targets that are even laid out in the IPCC report. So in the meantime, what could possibly be done to try to stall and slow the loss of critical marine ecosystems, and especially ecosystems that are reaching tipping points? So we're starting out with Arctic sea ice and doing a big scan of all the potential pathways to slow the loss of and or rebuild Arctic sea ice. So that includes things like protected areas. It includes things like targeted emissions reductions like methane. Methane emissions reductions would make an enormous impact for the Arctic, thinking about black carbon, but also thinking about some local interventions and potentially larger scale global interventions like solar radiation modification proposals, and really trying to put them all on the table and say, what do we know? What do we need to know? What research needs to be done? Again, not to do any of these things, but to try to make a decision. So that's the program that I'm leading right now.
But the danger of doing research that can develop technology and releasing this technology into a world where there's essentially no governance is huge. And so I'd say even if we were going to contemplate outdoor experimentation, the governance should come first. There's no treaty that forbids this. There's no national law in the U.S., even in democratic administrations. There was no national law in the U.S. that really controlled it. There's no national law in the U.K. that controls this. So if someone decides to just up and do it, there's very little leverage to actually bring some external controls.
I think the question of governance, how an effective global policy can be evolved in this area, is really just a special case of the broad question of how on earth we get coordinated global initiative on anything in this area. So I don't see this quite as an either-or, though. If we wait until we have an effective global governance system to apply to all these problems, we'll probably wait quite a long time.
There really isn't any alternative to doing our very best to get to net zero as fast as possible. Let's say the scenario, we get to net zero, but the world is 2.5 degrees warmer, and we'd like it to be 2 degrees warmer. Once we've already gotten close to net zero, and if the world is looking fairly, politically stable, then I'd say maybe then we start thinking about, a few years in advance of reaching net zero, we start thinking about whether we can trim 0.5 degree or so off the climate and off the warming and then bring us back down into a more comfortable level.
And if in 10, 15, 20, 30 years' time we need geoengineering, well, how about we get the infrastructure set up first? If next year you need a fire engine to put out a fire in your house, is that the time to start designing the fire engine?
I experience a roller coaster of emotions, thoughts, every different day feels different. Some days I feel hopeful, some days I feel, the governance challenges are massive. It's extremely overwhelming. If you would have told me a year ago that this is what I would be thinking about and doing, I would have said no, that's absolutely not what I would be thinking about and doing. But at the same time, we have to ask these questions, and not enough people are asking these questions about, is there anything that can be done? Like, what can be done? What types of actions are going to get us to where we need to be? And also, like, if we just say, no, we're not going to do research, we're not going to even think about these things, then if the world decides in 10 to 20 years that they want to move forward with some of these things, we won't be able to. We won't be able to motivate, to scale up, to have the research and the governance systems in place to actually address, this really important challenge that we're facing.
Geoengineering is a very wide topic. You have to understand there are, 80, 90 different solutions that they put forward. But some of the most extreme ones, such as solar radiation management, ocean fertilization, seabed curtains, modifying the albedo of the Arctic basin, could actually have really detrimental consequences on the ecosystems. As you know, ecosystems are very complex. Everything is interconnected. So, for example, if we spray aerosols in the stratosphere, it could modify the chemistry of rain, and it could create more acid rains. It could disturb the monsoon in Asia. If we put plastic white sheets over glaciers, for example, it could really bring a lot of pollutants and contaminants to the water towers of the world. So these are just, a couple of examples.
I'd say I'm also a skeptic.
Yeah.
But I think we need to do the research. I think we need to know, and we need people like me. We need people who are skeptical, but who also realize the severity and the reality of our situation, that we're not getting where we need to be with emissions reductions. Unfortunately, God, I wish that we weren't even having this conversation, right?
I would like to see some resources invested in, let's say, just a couple of possible schemes by government, so that we know the scale, the character of what we're talking about. At the moment, as I've said, there is a science fiction element in all this. There is a kind of wilder responsibility. We know nothing else works, but hey, almost anything might work in this area. That is beyond what we can be sure of. But that's why I think it would be good to see one or two scientifically reputable schemes just worked through so that we have a better idea of what the actual cost, financial and environmental and possibly social and political might be.
The consensus is that in the next 10, 15, 20 years, unless we change our habits, there will be substantial warming globally of our climate. What is my responsible response? Considered response as an engineer? Well, I'm going to start helping to design the fire engine, I'm afraid.
If it does come to a point where impacts are so high and risks are so high, there will be a radical intervention to help get things to become better. So I think that the colonial part, it's possible it could be enforced if countries do not have their own expertise, their own capacity to look into this, and they have to rely on, of course, the North coming in and proposing ideas to them and pushing a particular agenda. But this is why it is very urgent and immediately critical to really enhance the capacity of global South countries and universities and researchers to look into this work. And it doesn't matter whether we would ever need these technologies or whether we would never even have to use it. It doesn't matter. The fact that others are pushing for it and researching it and trying to understand more, we should take part in those process of answering the unknowns, which is currently what will help us to define, should we go further? Should we stop? Is it viable? Is it not viable? That should not be left to a particular kind of people and a kind of countries to look into that. That should be a global thing, and every country should be able to participate.
It is sort of said also that, well, SRM is uncertain. We don't understand it enough, and we should do it. And I guess my response is to say, well, there is also significant uncertainty heading into the future without intervention. If you do intervention, we're going back to conditions where the climate is something we've experienced and the models have been tested against, and the models have simulated volcanic eruption effects, which is how one way of trying to do intervention. Whereas going into the future of 2.5 or 3 degrees, the models haven't been run in those conditions before. We don't have verification of that. And sort of the experience has been, as we've been getting warmer, the models sort of underestimate what's happened.
So this is my first time kind of experiencing firsthand, face-to-face meeting the people who are very, adamantly opposed to even discussing any climate interventions. And I did know that block is it's a huge block of like the climate movement, and I know it, but this is the first time actually having the conversations with them face-to-face, and it has been really hard. It's been difficult trying to convince them that I don't like fossil fuels and that I'm really worried about that side of the whole issue as well. And those have been really difficult conversations because sometimes they can get kind of pretty heated and emotional.
First thing I need to do is to get through to the Labour government, especially the Rachel Reeves, that this may not be the biggest part of the budget, but this is not something they should be funding because it's harmful. But I'm also thinking about public protest. With regard to the ARIA program, in particular, their protocol for organizing outdoor experimentation does involve self-imposed governments in terms of consulting stakeholders. How seriously they take that will remain to be seen. But if people come out and flood those meetings in those places where the experiments are going to take place, that's another line of defense.
I haven't come across that many young people who would want to shut it down. Usually even the people who are very skeptical or critical towards these interventions, people who are very scared about, I'm part of all of these people. I am very critical and scared and stuff. But I feel like the usual response is like, okay, that's exactly why we should research it, or at least discuss the research. So I think that's very encouraging in a sense. Of course, there are young people who are opposed to interventions, but there is an encouraging amount of young people who are not ready to accept the damage that's unavoidable without those interventions.
What I do know with absolute certainty is if it comes down to the collapse of civilization or geoengineering, it's a no-brainer which one is going to be chosen or which one should be chosen. Now, it is something of an open question, I think, whether regimes are going to be clever enough to actually engage in that, because there could be a collective action problem around geoengineering. And there could be fascist regimes that just want to deny it altogether. So people really shouldn't assume that it's obvious.
Our approach is that think about risk framework. Yes, you understand there is a risk of doing climate interventions, but also think about what is the risk of not doing it, not getting ready for it. And when I think about, let us say, India and other lower latitude countries, that many parts of the world was going to be unlivable because the temperature is going to exceed what is called wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, which is the limit for human survivability. So beyond that, even if you are in the shade or anything, people are going to die. And this is a real scenario for many countries, including India. A part of the country is crossing this 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature, and millions of people are dying on the street. What would happen to that country? What the government will do at that time? There could be that they will break away and deploy something that could be very dangerous, because they are not ready for doing things. So what we are suggesting, even to the global science community, think about this scenario. And we are not suggesting go and deploy it at this moment, the SAI or the likes, but get ready, do the mitigation, create the framework, engage in this. This is what we are proposing at the time.
As a young person, I can only speak on my behalf. I can't speak from global south perspective or indigenous perspective. I'm only a girl from Finland. But as far as I know, it's really scary to hear that my future is like pretty there's like nothing for me. I want to read my books and focus on like writing fantasy novels or something, but that's not a future I'll have, because I have to fight these things. And I think it's really sad to hear that some adults are saying to us that no, these interventions should be like banned and the research is bad, and that's not what I meant. I'm only here to look the different options, and I think the number one thing is to phase out fossil fuels. It's number one thing for sure. There's no question to that. But we also have to look these other things. And yeah, as a young person, I'm really terrified if we can't like discuss these things. I'm also scared if we don't research these techniques, because there might be someone wanting to deploy these things. And at this moment, I feel these techniques would probably harm the environment and also our progression with climate policies. And I'm really terrified that we don't research these techniques properly and then we just deploy them in very unjust way. And I want the research to be made with indigenous people. For example, in Finland or in Samiland, there has been some really unethical research being made, and I really want to intervene that. I don't want anything like that happen ever again. And that's like where I'm really terrified.
Given now that it's clear as day that we have failed in our attempt to achieve emissions reductions, the COP processes just haven't worked. COP29, COP30, 30 years of trying to cut fossil fuel carbon dioxide emissions. Well, we just haven't achieved that. 30 years ago, it would have been absolutely right to say that geoengineering is a ridiculous distraction. We should focus entirely on emissions reductions. But now we really desperately need geoengineering. And I think it is right to say that the mood is more forgiving about geoengineering and allowing discussions to take place.
But on the 23rd of June this year, 2025, there's going to be a petition debated in Westminster because 160,000 signatories have called for a debate on the subject that geoengineering should be made illegal in the UK. It's still a divisive subject.
I see a future where ethical research is being made on climate interventions. I see a future where fossil fuel phase out is already there and we have made it, and I really hope that we won't use these techniques. I really hope that there is a future without climate intervention. That's my number one wish for the universe. Yeah.
I'm certainly not an advocate of climate engineering, but I would like to know what it is that I'm saying no to if I do want to say no to it. And I'd want to know how we balance the short-term need to save lives and protect the vulnerable with the long-term anxieties we naturally have about governance and other effects that go with exploring more aggressive approaches to controlling our environment. We've made a very bad job indeed of handling our environment and our climate in the last couple of hundred years. If human nature doesn't change all that much, we are quite capable of making at least as bad a job of it in the next couple of hundred years. But here we are, faced now with an unprecedented amount of scientific information about our situation, about the nature of the threat, faced with some apparently wild and very ambitious proposals about how we might minimize risk, and the best possible, most intelligent possible public discussion can only help us here.
Thank you for watching. Please do consider subscribing to ClimateGenn, or even better, become a member. I will be posting all these interviews into the members area on YouTube and Patreon. Many are already in the public domain. Thank you very much. If you are concerned about the future, then why not travel with me through every COP conference from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai by ordering my book COP Out: How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate. In COP Out, you'll gain insights into what is actually going on in these supposed world-saving conferences and how we have ended up in this dire era of dangerous consequences. You can order COP Out via the link in the notes or on any online bookstore worldwide in paperback or audio version.